In this lecture, we're going to cover integumentary system. First of all, let me clarify what organ is. So organ is a structure in our body composed of two or more different types of tissues which perform specific function. For example, skin is an organ, heart is an organ, brain is an organ. Now let's focus on integumentary system. So the integumentary system includes the skin and its accessory organs such as hair, nails, and glands. And dermatology is the study of the integumentary system. We need to understand that the skin is the largest organ of our body, and it acts as a barrier between internal environment and external environment. Skin consists of two layers, the outer epidermis and the deeper dermis. Epidermis is made of epithelial tissue, while dermis is made of connective tissue, where you can also find blood vessels, smooth muscles, and nerves. There's another layer which is called hypodermis or subcutaneous layer. This is not considered a true part of the skin. This layer is primarily made of loose connective tissue such as areolar and adipose tissue, and large blood vessels run in this layer. This slide depicts various layers of skin. So first of all, in the top you can see the epidermis, which is a relatively thin layer. As I said earlier, this layer is made of epithelial tissue. The specific type of epithelial tissue is stratified squamous epithelium. However, in the top it also has a layer of dead cell, which is basically the keratinized layer. Below the epidermis, we have dermis layer, which is made of connective tissue. In this layer, you see blood vessel branches. You also see free nerve endings, and hair follicle and hair shaft is also located here. Additionally, the two types of glands you can find are sweat gland and sebaceous gland. And below the dermis, we have another layer which is not considered a true part of skin, but nonetheless, it's a layer which separates the dermis, or in other words, which separates the skin from the underlying muscle. This layer is called subcutaneous layer. This layer is primarily made of fat tissue, and large blood vessels run in this layer. Skin is also a sensory organ, and it helps us sense change in temperature, pain, and pressure. So if you look into the dermis layer, you find at least three types of receptors there. First of all, you have free nerve endings, which act as a receptor for pain and temperature. Then you can also see that some nerves toward the end, they have these bulged structure which are called corpuscle. There are two types of them. You have tactile or Meissner corpuscle, which is closer to the skin surface. They detect gentle touch and gentle pressure. While there's another type of corpuscle called lamellator or Pacinian corpuscle, which is slightly away from epidermis, and they sense any deep pressure and vibration. The epidermis is made of several layers, and the deepest layer is called the basal layer, where we have epithelial cells more act as a stem cells, and they generate the other layers of the cells. As basal cells divide, the older cells are called keratinocyte, and as the keratinocyte migrates from the basal layer more toward upward, there's a protein called keratin builds up in the keratinocyte, and eventually due to abundance of keratin inside the cytoplasm of cell, keratinocyte dies and they create a dead layer, and this process is called keratinization. The cells of epidermis are arranged in 4 to 5 layers. First of all, we have stratum basal, which is the innermost layer resting on the basement membrane. It consists of a single layer of cuboidal cells and also stem cells and keratinocytes. Melanocytes, tactile cells are also scattered among these cells. Then we have stratum spinosum, which consists of several layers of keratinocytes. And as cells are pushed upward by cell division, they lose the ability to divide, but they can produce more keratin fibers. Then we have the stratum granulosum, which consists of 3 to 5 layers of flat keratinocytes. The dark staining keratohyalin granules give the layer its name. Then we have the stratum lucidum, which is a thin translucent zone external to the stratum granulosum, and it is seen only in thick skin. Finally, the outermost layer is called stratum corneum, which consists of up to 30 layers of dead, scaly keratinized cells that form the surface layer. Melanocytes are located in stratum basal, and they synthesize the pigment melanin. Melanocytes shed melanin-containing fragments from the tips of branching processes. Then the keratinocytes phagocytize these fragments and accumulate melanin on the sunny side of nucleus. It's worth mentioning that the function of melanin is to shield DNA from the damaging effect of ultraviolet radiation. Skin color is produced by pigment molecules, and the most significant pigment molecule is melanin, which is produced by melanocytes and accumulated in keratinocytes. The two forms of melanin are brownish black, which is called eomelanin, and reddish yellow, which is called pheomelanin. And people with different skin color have the same number of melanocytes. However, in dark-skinned people, the melanin is more spread out through the keratinocytes, while in the light-skinned people, the melanin remains clumped near the nucleus. Also, the amount of melanin in the skin varies with exposure to ultraviolet radiation, which stimulates melanin synthesis. An important factor is in skin variation is due to ancestral exposure to ultraviolet radiation, which accounts for geographic and ethnic differences in skin color today. Next, we have dermis, which is a connective tissue beneath the epidermis. It is primarily composed of collagen fibers, but it also has elastic and reticular fibers and the fibroblast cells as well. In this layer, we have hair follicles and nails root embedded. So the boundary between the dermis and epidermis is somewhat wavy, and the upward waves are called dermal papillae and downward waves are called epidermal ridges. It is worth mentioning that on the fingerprint, this wavy boundary produces the friction ridges, which are responsible for fingerprints. The dermis also contain blood vessels which carry a nutrient for the epidermis. The dermis also contain free nerve endings and sensory receptors, also hair follicles and the sebaceous and sweat glands as well. Nails are clear, hard derivatives of the stratum corneum, composed of thin, dead, scaly cells, which are densely packed together and filled with parallel fibers of hard keratin. The hard part of the nail is the nail plate, which includes the free edge, the nail body, and the nail root. The free edge of the nail plate is the part overhanging the tip of the finger or toe, and then the nail body is the visible attached part of the nail. Then we have the nail root, which extends underneath the overlying skin. The surrounding skin rises a bit above the nail as nail folds and separated from the margin of the nail plate by a nail groove. And nail groove is the area where sometimes bacteria and dirt collects. Finally, we have the skin underlying the nail plate, which is called the nail bed. Here is a slender filament of keratinized cells that grow from a hair follicle. And structurally speaking, a hair has 3 zones along its length, and these zones are the bulb, which is a swelling at the base where the hair originates in the dermis or hypodermis. Then we have the root, which is the remainder of the hair within the hair follicle. The shaft is the portion of the hair above the skin surface, and then the only living cell of hair are in and near the bulb, which grows around a bud of vascular connective tissue called the dermal papillae. There's also a smooth muscle associated with hair, and that is called piloerector muscle. And piloerector muscles are bundles of smooth muscle cells extending from the dermal collagen fibers to the connective tissue root sheet of the follicle. The sympathetic nervous system, which is part of the autonomic nervous system, controls the contraction of the muscle in response to cold, fear, or other stimuli, and as a result, it gives us goosebumps. So similar to skin, hair color is due to pigment granules. Brown hair and black hair are rich in eumelanin, and red hair has a slight amount of eumelanin and a higher concentration of pheomelanin. Blonde hair has some pheomelanin but very little eumelanin. And then we have gray hair, which is due to the absence of melanin. There's also a condition called albinism, which is a genetic lack of melanin, or as we grow older, the hair become whiter. Then we have two types of skin glands. These are sebaceous gland and sweat gland. So sebaceous glands produce an oily secretion called sebum, and they are flask-shaped with short ducts that usually open in a hair follicle. Sebaceous glands are holocrine glands with little visible lumen, and their secretion consists of broken down cells replaced by mitosis. Sebum, which is the product of sebaceous gland, keeps the skin and hair follicle from becoming dry, brittle, and cracked. Next, we have sweat gland, and sweat gland releases their product by exocytosis. There are two types of sweat glands, eccrine and apocrine. So eccrine sweat gland is the most abundant type of sweat gland. They are distributed throughout the skin, and they release a watery product in response to body temperature. On the other hand, apocrine glands are located in certain areas such as axilla and groin, and they are activated at puberty in response to emotion, fear, sexual arousal, and things along that line. They produce a product which contains protein and fat, and over time the protein and fat goes bad, and that's how body odor is produced. There are also modified forms of sweat glands, for example, ceruminous gland, which is located in ear canal. Ceruminous glands produces an oily product called wax, which protects the air from dust and other pathogens. Another modified form of sweat gland is mammary gland, which produce milk. We discussed the structure of the skin. Now let's move on and discuss the function of the skin. And skin has important function to our body, but I could say that it's a critical part of maintaining homeostasis. So, for example, skin acts as a resistance to trauma and infection. It acts as a barrier to absorbing excess water or losing body water. It blocks ultraviolet radiation. It also acts as a barrier to chemicals and drugs and poisons. Skin helps to produce vitamin D. Skin acts as a sensory receptor. In the skin, we have a variety of nerve endings which can help us to sense heat, cold, touch, texture, pressure, vibration, and other types of sensation. And finally, the important function related to skin is that it helps with thermoregulation. So we have thermoreceptors in the skin, and they transmit the information to the brain, resulting in maintaining a normal body temperature.